As long as people have been sentenced to death, there's always been the chance of dramatic and often bloody disaster. Here are some of the most notorious botched executions of all time. In the early days, the most common method of execution was beheading, in the most low-tech manner, a person swinging an axe at an unfortunate victim's neck. That was the fate that awaited Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. A noblewoman in the 1500s, she committed a crime for which there was no pardon, falling out of favor with the notorious King Henry VIII. Despite no trial, she was sentenced to death and taken to the execution block. But to her horror, her executioner wasn't a hulking man who had swung many an axe. It was a young, uncoordinated man who had to take 11 swings to kill her, repeatedly striking her head and shoulders before finally hitting the mark. In medieval England, no one was safe from a bloody execution, even the most powerful. Mary, Queen of Scots, was Queen of Scotland for 25 years and engaged in a bloody power struggle with her cousin Elizabeth I. Mary was considered the rightful queen by many of England's Catholics, and when Mary was deposed and forced to seek refuge in England, she found herself imprisoned. After 8 years in custody, she was accused of attempting to assassinate Elizabeth and sentenced to death by beheading. The first blow only glanced the back of her head, and the second killed her, but left her half-severed head hanging off her neck to the horror of onlookers. But these weren't the worst executioners the world had ever seen. Jack Ketch was an executioner under the reign of King Charles II, and he was so bad at taking heads that his name eventually became a synonym for death and the devil. During the chaotic 1680s filled with multiple coup attempts, Ketch botched the executions of several noblemen for treason. When William Russell came before his axe, Ketch repeatedly struck at him and seemed distracted as the crowd watched the gory display. 2 years later, the execution of James Scott, 1st Duke of Monmouth, took a shocking 5 to 8 strokes. The execution was so badly botched that the crowd revolted, nearly attacking Ketch and forcing the guards to spirit him away before he became the second execution of the day. The science of executions advanced, but they didn't become foolproof. The invention of the guillotine put headsmen like Jack Ketch out of work, replacing the axe with a mechanical device that would neatly slice the heads off with falling blades. It became synonymous with the French Revolution and a reign of terror when countless nobles and political enemies were beheaded, most famously Queen Marie Antoinette. But when it came time for her husband Louis XVI to meet his end, things went horribly wrong. Louis XVI was a large man, and eyewitnesses said the blade got stuck midway through his neck, only partially severing his head. The bloody blade had to be raised and dropped again, finishing the job to bring the king's life to an undignified end. Beheading is by far the bloodiest execution method, but far from the only one prone to errors. In the Old West, there was one popular execution method, hanging. And in 1852, a Canadian soldier named Yankee Jim Robinson found that out the hard way. The young man tried to steal a boat and was shocked when he was charged with not theft, but piracy on the high seas, a death penalty crime. He was quickly convicted and taken to the gallows, and the tall man quickly realized the scaffold wasn't nearly high enough. Instead of his neck neatly snapping at the end of the drop, he spent half an hour slowly strangling while hanging. It's no surprise locals in modern-day San Diego claim his ghost still haunts the site. But that wasn't the only botched hanging in the US. What execution was so bad it brought an end to capital punishment in Minnesota? That would be the death of William Williams. A minor, he carried on a secret relationship with local teenager John Keller. When Keller refused to answer William's letters at his parents' insistence, William came to the Keller home and murdered John Keller and his mother. Sentenced to death by hanging, Williams was taken to the gallows in 1906, but the rope was too long. He hit the floor and was injured, but the local sheriff wanted the execution completed, so he ordered his men to pull the rope back up until Williams was strangled to death. The horror led to the abolition of the death penalty in the state 5 years later, and it has never been reinstated. At least firing squad, execution by a hail of bullets, should be pretty foolproof, right? Well, not exactly. As Wallace Wilkerson found out, the cattle worker got into a nasty argument with bartender William Baxter over a card game, and the hot-tempered Wilkerson pulled out a gun and shot Baxter. He was quickly captured and kept under guard to prevent a lynching. Sentenced to death at trial, Wilkerson chose a firing squad, and although appeals were filed by his lawyer, in 1879 he met his fate. He was blindfolded and shot by a group of guards, only for every single one of them to miss his heart. Badly wounded and bleeding, Wilkerson lay on the ground gasping. While officials initially talked about shooting him again, he eventually expired from blood loss after less than half an hour. Well, then no one person could survive poison gas, right? The gas chamber was a 20th century innovation in the death penalty, using an airtight chamber and a combination of poisonous gases to bloodlessly kill the condemned. That was the fate that awaited Jimmy Lee Gray, a Mississippi child murderer who was sentenced to death for his second murder. In 1983, he was taken to the death chamber, but there was a design flaw that the officials hadn't accounted for. An iron bar behind the death chair was within reach, and Gray's head wasn't strapped down. When the gas flooded in, Gray began thrashing his head violently and slammed his head against the bar repeatedly before losing consciousness. The room was cleared, and it's unclear whether the gas or the blows to the head ultimately killed him. But no execution method has caused more controversy than the electric chair, a chair designed to restrain the inmate and send a fatal electric shock through their body. The electric chair had been used to kill a horse effectively in testing. But when it came time to execute William Kimmler in 1890, things went very differently. The peddler and heavy drinker had been convicted of killing his common-law wife, and New York chose to make him a test case for the new execution method. The chair was turned on, and Kimmler was hit with 1,000 volts and quickly knocked unconscious. While he was immediately declared dead, witnesses noticed he was still breathing. The attending physician ordered the current turned on again, and this time it definitely worked. 2,000 volts hit Kimmler, the blood vessels in his skin burst, and his body caught fire, sending a horrible stench through the room. It wouldn't be the last time the electric chair shocked witnesses. Jesse Tefero was facing the death penalty for the shooting of an officer in Florida, despite only being a passenger in the car during the fatal traffic stop. Many speculated the real killer was the driver, Walter Rhodes, but Rhodes testified against him and Tefero was convicted. His date with the electric chair was May 4, 1990, but things didn't go smoothly. One of the critical parts of the electric chair execution is using a sponge on the head to increase the conductivity and ensure a quick death. But the team had used a synthetic sponge, not an organic one. This caused flames to shoot out of Tefero's head, shocking onlookers, and it took a 7-minute process of 3 jolts to kill Tefero. Some even speculated that the chair had been sabotaged to make Tefero suffer. To add insult to injury, Rhodes confessed to being the shooter after Tefero's death. The electric chair was quickly becoming notorious and would soon fall out of favor in Florida. The last straw was the execution of Alan Lee Davis, a notorious mass murderer sentenced to death for the murder of Nancy Weiler. He would remain on death row until 1999 when he met the electric chair. There was just one problem. He had been on blood thinner medications before his execution. Witnesses would say his nose had begun bleeding before he was electrocuted, but the guards didn't hesitate. And when the shocks went through Davis's body, he began bleeding profusely. An autopsy revealed severe burns all over his head, legs, and groin. And while an inquiry showed the chair had worked properly, that was enough for Florida to designate lethal injection the primary method of execution in the future. But that modern method isn't foolproof either. Lethal injection is the most bloodless modern method of execution, using a cocktail of drugs on a restrained inmate to put them to sleep and then stop their heart. It's supposed to be painless, but that wasn't the case for Arizona inmate Joseph Rudolph Wood III. Convicted of murdering his ex-girlfriend and her father, he was taken to the death chamber in July 2014, and what was supposed to be a quick execution took a terrible twist. While one dose was supposed to be enough to kill Wood, witnesses reported that the staff injected Wood 15 times, trying to give him a fatal dose. The execution took almost 2 hours, long enough for Wood's lawyers to file one final appeal with the Supreme Court, arguing that the ongoing execution was cruel and unusual punishment. It was denied, a half hour after Wood finally expired. But there's another kind of execution that went horribly wrong, the one where the condemned actually survives. Romel Broom was awaiting death in Ohio after being convicted for the kidnapping and murder of a teenage girl. While he had filed an appeal and obtained a DNA test, he wasn't exonerated, and his date with a needle was fast approaching. In September 2009, he was strapped to the gurney and the execution began, only for the executioners to struggle to find a vein. The execution was called off and the governor issued a 1-week stay, and a series of appeals began arguing that to execute him again would be cruel and unusual punishment. Eventually, appeals were denied and Broom was scheduled to die in June 2020, only for it to be called off due to the pandemic. But Broom would never meet the executioner. He died in prison in December 2020. The next case faced death and wound up cheating death. Doyle Ham was on Alabama's death row for the killing of Patrick Cunningham in a motel robbery. While awaiting execution in 2014, he came down with lymphatic cancer. The cancer and treatments damaged Ham's veins, making it difficult for the executioner to find a vein, leading to almost 3 hours of the team poking him with needles. The painful spectacle in 2018 led to an international condemnation, and Ham's legal team filed lawsuits. Ultimately, Alabama settled with Ham and agreed to not set a second execution date, meaning that Ham still sits in prison, having successfully beaten execution and, so far, cancer. But convicts have survived far more violent methods of execution. It was 1740 in England when William Duell was sentenced to hang. The 17-year-old had been convicted as an accessory to rape and was being hung along with 4 others. The execution seemed to go off smoothly as he hung for 20 minutes before being cut down. His body was sent to a medical training college for dissection when the workers noticed something strange. Duell was still breathing. Within 2 hours, he was awake and had no recollection of being hung. He had been sick before his execution, which some say might have led to his survival. Instead of trying to execute him again, the law changed his sentence to exile in North America, where he lived in Boston for another 65 years. But could anyone survive a firing squad? Wenceslao Miguel Herrera did, although no one's quite sure why. It was 1915, in the midst of the violent Mexican Revolution, when he was arrested for being a revolutionary. It was wartime, there was no trial, only an impromptu finding of guilt and a quick firing squad. Witnesses say he was shot at least 8 times in the body and then shot once in the head to ensure he was dead. But what comes next is up for debate. Some say he was found unconscious in the bodies of his fellow revolutionaries. Others say he crawled to a church for sanctuary and recovered there. What is clear is that he lived for another 60 years after his shooting, even appearing on the Ripley's Believe It or Not radio show in 1937. But no one had the sheer luck of John Babacombe Lee. A notorious thief and former Navy cadet in England, Lee was convicted in 1885 of murdering his employer, Emma Keyes. While the evidence was weak, Lee's reputation preceded him, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. He maintained his innocence, but the gallows were waiting at Exeter Prison. That's where something odd happened. The trapdoor under the scaffold failed to open. Famous executioner James Barry presided and couldn't explain the failure in the device, nor could he explain how it kept happening in 2 future attempted executions. It seems John Babacombe Lee was the man they couldn't hang, and he soon became famous. Amid public attention, Lee's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment by the Home Secretary, allowing him to keep fighting to prove his innocence. He was eventually released in 1907 and lived to 80 years old, becoming a celebrity as the man who beat death 3 times. Check out 50 insane death penalty and execution facts that'll shock you for more of the death penalty's darkest secrets, or watch this video instead.